Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's event, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, 1 month later, implementation and impact on human rights, supply chains, and accountability. I'm Dave Shulman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, and we're delighted to be hosting today's session in partnership with the Council's Strategic Litigation Project and Geotech Center. The collaboration between these three Atlantic Council programs on this event really reflects the mission of the Global China Hub, which is to develop solutions to the greatest challenges posed by China's rise by leveraging the collective expertise found across the Council's 16 programs and centers. We're convening today's event together in order to assess the current state of implementation of the Forced Labor Prevention Act, which entered into force last month, as well as to explore its future impact. As our audience knows, the core objective of the Act is to, quote, ensure that goods made with forced labor in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of the People's Republic of China do not enter the United States market. But beside this undeniably important and seemingly straightforward objective lie a range of complex issues surrounding enforcement, human rights advocacy and accountability, and global supply chains for some of the most important emerging technologies. Thankfully, we have a fantastic group of speakers for today's event who are ready to help unpack each of these important topics. Before we get started, I'd like to remind our audience in Zoom that they can submit their questions using the Q&A feature, so that our moderator may draw on them over the course of the discussion. With that, I'd like to introduce today's moderator. Linda Rebuttable is an award-winning multi-platform storyteller. She's an internationally published writer, senior broadcaster, and presenter with extensive reporting from global hotspots for leading media, including CNN, The Washington Post, BBC, Al Jazeera, and Deutsche Welle. Working for CNN out of Greece, she has produced, directed, and presented news and analysis on the country's financial crisis, the rise of political extremism, and the ongoing global refugee crisis. We're delighted to have Elinda with us today, and I'd like to pass over to her now to get things going. Elinda, please, over to you.
Thank you so much, David, for that introduction. I would also like to welcome our panelists and our audience, and I would like to take the opportunity to say just a few words closely linked to the significance of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. I have covered human rights issues for over 20 years for, as you said, a number of the world's biggest global media. And most of my work in China was during the build-up to the 2008 Beijing Olympics. And most of the stories I did at the time were about human rights. So I documented a lot of labor practices ahead of the Olympics, you know, the stories of construction workers from the provinces surviving on next to nothing. And the reason I'm going back to that time and saying all this is just because, you know, this in some ways is not a new situation with China. The human rights discourse at the time was focused on Tibet. And very good colleagues desperately tried to get to Xinjiang as well, but very few managed. And they came back, however, the ones who did, with horrific reports of abuse of the Uyghur population. Now, this is all 15 years ago. So today, this global concern about forced labor practices has really reached a new limit. And this panel is relevant to decisions we all make as citizens of democratic countries, consumers, about also everyday stuff, the clothes we wear, the accessories we buy, and who makes them, what importing or not importing goods produced in conditions of forced labor means for our economies, the impact on supply chains, and meeting other global targets such as energy goals, but also our values, the world we want to live in, and the sacrifices and compromises that we're willing to make. There's a legal framework that guides these actions, and of course, enforcement and compliance. Now, to start our discussion, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act came into effect on June 21st. And under the new law, all importing businesses in the US have to prove that imports from Xinjiang are not produced using forced labor. So the immediate questions that come to mind are, well, can this new law really help put an end to forced labor and other human rights abuses in Xinjiang and pave the way to other human rights legislation, both in the US, but also worldwide? Well, we're going to be discussing these and related issues with our four panelists today, our four esteemed panelists today, that I would very much like to welcome. These are Anne-Marie Highsmith. She's the Executive Assistant Commissioner, Office of Trade at the US Customs and Border Protection. Welcome, Anne-Marie. Elnagar Iltabir, she is a former director for China at the US National Security Council. Rehan Assad, a non-resident senior fellow at the Strategic Litigation Project at the Atlantic Council, and Kit Conklin, a non-resident senior fellow at the Geotech Center at the Atlantic Council. I would also encourage our audience to submit questions throughout the chat. We will try to incorporate these questions in our discussion as we go along. And to better understand the situation in Xinjiang, I would first of all like to invite our panelist, Rehan Assad, who is from Xinjiang, to tell us a few words about her personal experience. Her brother Akbar Assad has gone missing there in 2016. Ms. Assad, what is going on in Xinjiang?
Hi, Linda, thank you so much. As you mentioned, discrimination against the Uyghurs is not a new issue. It's been going around for a long time, as early as you mentioned, since early 2000, when there was a huge migration of the Han population to the Uyghur region. But at the time, discrimination was manifested in terms of displacing Uyghurs in terms of job, employment opportunities, or prosperity of the Uyghur region in terms of economic and other resource sharing. But up until 2014, everything has changed when the current leadership rolled out this policy called Strike Hard campaign. Striking hard means striking hard against extremism, terrorism, and separatism. But this just became a pretext, but ultimately it became anti-Uyghur policy. It's striking against the very identity of Uyghurs, what makes them as this wonderful and glorious community whose culture and history the world should be blessed to have as part of our world heritage. So individuals like my brother, who is part of the Uyghur elites, were the primary targets for the concentration camps that China has built since 2016, where at least 1 million of people are being detained right now without any due process, for just simply being who they are. And as the crisis evolved, Uyghurs became the drivers of Chinese economy through forced labor. Within the camps, we've seen forced labor factories are being built, but at the same time, Chinese government is busing people from the Uyghur region to other parts of China where they're working against their will. And not only as a lawyer, but also as a family member of a victim, these are horrifying thoughts that I have to think about every day when I think about that. If I'm buying a clothes from any store, is this piece of clothes being tainted with my own community's forced labor? And nobody should live with that kind of conscience. And this is why it's really important that we do have a legislation that hopefully is in my view, is a path-breaking legislation that would really steer the international community to create anti-slavery human rights regime.
So, as you're saying, this is legislation that, in your opinion, is very much needed. Well, let's go to Anne-Marie Highsmith, just to understand a little bit more about enforcement. How is the US Customs and Border Protection enforcing this new law, Anne-Marie?
So, thank you very much, Alinda. Our forced labor activities actually date back to the Tariff Act of 1930. So these are old programs for us at CBP, but the Uyghur Act, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, does in fact provide significant additional enforcement tools for the agency, creating the rebuttable presumption that any merchandise that comes out of that region or from downstream related parties to companies in that region, and then other businesses that appear on an entities list, which is a dynamic, growing part of our enforcement activities. That any of that merchandise is presumed to have been made with forced labor. So that is a tremendous tool for us, because no longer is the burden on us to demonstrate that it was made with forced labor. The burden now is shifting to the importer to demonstrate that the merchandise has not been made with forced labor. So a tremendous tool for us. But I would like to say at the outset that this is not forced labor is not a situation we're going to seize our way out of. And the language of the statute focuses on the merchandise itself. No merchandise can be imported into the United States. Our goal at CBP is of course to prevent that importation, but rather taking a longer view to prevent that merchandise from being manufactured in the first place using forced labor conditions. So in that vein, the old adage that the best defense is a great offense. We stepped off initially with a great deal of education, which we have been ramping up as we approach the effective date on June 21st. Lots of education to our trade stakeholders so that they are aware. They can trace their own supply chains effectively, that they are aware of the business consequences, the financial consequences, the reputational consequences of being involved with the importation and a manufacture of merchandise with forced labor. And we think that our education campaign is having effects, and that is amplifying as we now have reached the 21st and we are at first engagement. So I did want to point out that we weren't at full stop, right? We didn't like start enforcing forced labor laws on June 21st, but we do have these new tools. And so we're doing our best to work with our stakeholding community to address the larger problem, not just on a box by box, shipment by shipment basis, but from a larger perspective.
And of course, there are precedents. There are other things that we can discuss as we go along on that. And of course, the challenges as well. And I'm looking forward to hearing more on that. But, one thing that comes to mind, and this is a question for Elnagar, this is very strong legislation. It's very powerful legislation, what happened here. What has been the response from China, and how has it impacted US-China relations?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. As you said, this has been a very powerful message to the world that the most powerful nation on earth would stand up to the second most powerful country, militarily and economically, and say that we will not tolerate genocide, we will not tolerate slavery. And in terms of relationship, in terms of China's response, as we all know, I would say, contrary to many arguments of, oh, this policy is going to complicate our relationship, ruin, destroy our bilateral trade ties. In fact, China's response has been very muted. They do not have the leverage in this relationship. The United States has the leverage, as we have seen with the tariffs on trade, to impose economic and reputational costs on the CCP to hold them accountable for its crimes. And China obviously had its anti-foreign sanctions laws and other laws to boycott and then obviously use nationalistic sentiments and its trolls to boycott US companies. And that story has been in the headlines. However, in short, I would say this has actually led to a better world in the sense that not only we were able to uphold our values and defend the humanity here, but also we were able to do something that is in our economic interest, and that is leveling the playing field for US companies and for other companies that have to compete with Chinese companies that are illegally and using illegal and unfair trade practices, such as forced labor, such as subsidies and other IP theft and other practices to get ahead. So I would say, and we can see that in terms of reaction to the law from other countries. As you know, UK, Canada, and other countries have issued similar guidance and started looking into their own laws. Germany has a law that will go into effect next year. EU is looking at supply chain due diligence law that is being debated currently. And our USMCA partners, Canada and Mexico, also have to, as part of the deal, have to prevent forced labor-made goods from entering their territory. So I have not seen any country defending China's slavery practices and opposing our legislation. In fact, I would say this legislation sends such a powerful message to the world, deterring would-be tyrants, would-be genocidal regimes, and would-be, the future slavery practitioners of slavery from thinking twice, because the United States was going to stand up and put a stop to this practice.
So it's certainly something that's being watched, worldwide, both from China, of course, but other countries as well. And potentially it might help legislation in other places as well. All the same, I'm sure it's causing immense confusion in the business community, or at least some of the business community. And I wanted to turn to Kit for that. In your experience and advising businesses on compliance, how feasible is it to get access to information on how things are produced, how anything from clothes to electronics is produced in Xinjiang, and what happens when this is not possible? How can companies bring the right paperwork, the right material forward in order to be able to import their goods?
Yeah, it's a great question. So at its core, the law is really a fundamental game changer for industry, not just in the United States, but around the world. And industry is a bit confused right now. There's never really been a widespread utilization by the US government of a rebuttable presumption. So even describing what that means has been a learning curve for some of the biggest companies and the biggest importers in the United States. But at the core of this issue really is, how do you actually comply with the law? CBP has been great. They've issued a large series of guidance on what types of red flags to look for. The Xinjiang Supply Chain Business Advisory did that originally in 2020, updated in 2021, and now we have, of course, the UFLPA guidance, which outlines those types of red flags for forced labor. Things like connections back to the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, the cotton supply chain, polysilicon, and now we have the UFLPA entity list. So the US government has publicly identified 20 or so companies in China as being connected back to forced labor. And industry has really latched on to this idea because commerce historically has done that. OFAC with sanctions has historically done that. But what's a little bit different with the forced labor law versus sanctions and export controls is, how do you actually find information about forced labor within global supply chains? So industry has to do two things. First, they have to trace their raw materials back to Xinjiang to ensure if they want, they can overcome that rebuttable presumption, which will be very difficult. So that means having information on your supply chain in one of the most opaque, hard to discover intelligence jurisdictions in the world. And you have to do that at scale. And you have to do that not just for products that are being imported directly from Xinjiang. Most US companies aren't doing that. But you have to be able to ensure that that product or that widget that you're importing from Mexico, from Indonesia, from Vietnam, isn't ultimately sourced back to Xinjiang. And companies are really struggling with that right now because the Chinese government recognizes and appreciates that US CBP is looking to stop those shipments. So data is drying up. Information about supply chains is drying up. It's still possible, of course, to find that information, but industry is really scratching their heads on how to efficiently comply with this law without having to go to NGOs all day, every day and ask for boots on the ground support in Xinjiang, which risks there's a number of different types of risks that aren't long-term sustainable for that type of activity. But I'll just close on a comment that Rehan mentioned earlier, and it's that not only do companies in the United States and the West have to be considerate of the raw materials and the supply chains connected back to Xinjiang, but they also need to be aware of those labor transfers. And this is very difficult to find at scale. So the ethnic Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang that are being involuntarily transferred from their homes to manufacturing facilities in other provinces throughout China, all of that is representative of forced labor risk per the UFLPA and subject to enforcement. And so there's a tremendous amount of upheaval and confusion in industry right now, and CBP is doing a great job of helping educate that, but there's never been a law like this. So it will take some time to ensure compliance is effectively managed for industry at scale.
Well, as you say, there's never been a law like this, but on the other hand, there have been precedents. And for example, we have the example of cotton from Xinjiang, which is about 80% of what China produces. So that's a very significant precedent to fall back onto. Anne-Marie, can you tell us a little bit about what has happened in prior examples? You know, what has been the outcome? How have you overcome some of the challenges that Kit just mentioned?
Right. So the reason we have the rebuttable presumption is for the exact reason we're talking about. The Chinese government is trying to keep us from getting the information that we need to make these determinations. So the rebuttable presumption is helpful. But if you're a company trying to trace your supply chain, by the way, by clear and convincing evidence, importers must demonstrate that their merchandise is free from forced labor in whole or in part, which if you are a company with a very dispersed supply chain or a highly manufactured product, that it's more complicated. Sometimes it's just a shipment of tomatoes from Mexico, and that's not a complicated supply chain to trace. But the open source media has been reporting in great volume concerning the challenges that the solar industry is having with regard to the silica-based products. And it's exactly that, a complicated, dispersed supply chain. So we do have a dynamic risk-based targeting approach that we apply. It gets smarter as we apply it and as new data comes to light. And so we at least with regard to the Xinjiang region, we have been enforcing WROs from that region since 2017. We've issued 33 WROs, not just on cotton and tomatoes and silica-based products that the Uyghur Act actually calls out as high-risk products, but also computer parts, hair products, apparel, garments, and other goods from China. So a large majority of the merchandise that we had been seeing or that will fall under the Uyghur Act, we've been targeting it for a while. So businesses who are operating in that region they had a good shot to change their supply chains, right? If they didn't change their supply chain in response to our earlier activities, 2017, 2019, the 2020 business advisory updated 2021, this is a wake-up call for them. And so we have spent the last 6 months with these companies helping them work through the areas of highest risk in their supply chains. And what we have seen is that companies at high risk, and even at companies at lower risk who are trying to comply before we stop their shipment on the dock, have been verticalizing their supply chains. They've been changing their contract terms to ensure that no merchandise made with forced labor enters into their product. They've been requiring documentation before the merchandise is laden on board. And they've been sending out auditors in order to try to confirm that their merchandise has been made in humane conditions. They've been nearshoring, they've been friendshoring, and they've been returning manufacturing to the United States.
Thanks. That's really useful. I wanted to ask you a question. It's a clarification that somebody from the audience is asking, actually. They're asking, does Section 3 of the Act or any other section apply to forced Uyghur labor outside of Xinjiang? Do we have something specific on that? And that's maybe an open question if maybe somebody else has looked into it.
I actually don't know that I have that on on the tip of my pen, so to speak.
I can take that question.
I can,
As Anne-Marie said, the core or the need for this legislation was that the forced labor in the region was so pervasive, so large scale, so systematic that issuing WROs on individual company or even sector, and at the end we even went for the whole region on the cotton products, cotton and tomato products. That was just not enough. It was just not addressing the issue. So there was a need for this rebuttable presumption to shift the burden from U.S. government to the companies. So, and that in the later reiteration, I was lucky enough to be, initially I was at the NSC, talking to our colleagues in Congress, and later on I was actually in Congress to see the later iterations of this legislation. The Senate, the later Senate version, added an important component to the legislation, and that is not just Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region, but it also applies to forced labor outside of the region. And that reason for that was when we just focus on the forced Uyghur labor in the region, Chinese government started the practice of labor transfer, transferring Uyghurs from their livelihood, the traditional communities, to other provinces, to other parts of the country, to basically herd them into factories. And we can get into the political objectives behind this. I would love to talk more about that. But in short, we were not capturing, we were in a way incentivizing China to engage in more labor transfer outside of Xinjiang. So that's why the legislation, the final version, includes a component that says forced labor of Uyghurs and other minorities in Xinjiang, but also entities that are through power delegation or all kinds of schemes connected to forced labor in the region, or entities using raw materials, inputs produced with forced labor from the region. So if a factory in eastern part of China, or for Vietnam for that matter, is producing an apparel that uses cotton from Xinjiang, that merchandise theoretically is subject to the detention. Over.
Alnigar, sorry, Alinda, if I could just add 2 points. Like, whenever Congress passes the legislation, there is a legislative intent or legislative goal. What is the goal of this legislation? To curb forced labor. The forced labor or slavery should be outlawed from our supply chain. That is the legislative intent of these path-breaking legislation. So that's why it doesn't matter whether it's happening in other parts of China, because as Alnigar mentioned, there is a forced labor transfer scheme orchestrated by the government, commissioned by the state. It's so very well done. Another thing often people don't talk about it is that, because this is a democracy, the US Congress elicited, or CBP elicited comment from everybody, including civil society, even Chinese companies, in relation to this legislation. So there was about 277 submissions from civil society as well as private companies, among which Chinese companies also provided their feedback. Why? And if you see that the comments, there were many companies from other parts of China, not specifically Xinjiang, actually submitted their comment, precisely because this legislation would affect them. And also it suggests that they are themselves implicated in the exploitation of Uyghur forced labor. So that's why I think we need to make it very clear that this legislation is intended to curb forced labor, whether it applies to companies that are thriving in the Chinese Xinjiang economy or in the Chinese economy with the assistance of forced labor. So yeah, that's just like my two cents.
Can I just turn to Alnigar, and I'll go back to Anne-Marie in a minute. Alnigar, and we're getting a lot of audience questions related to that, which are about the bigger geopolitical picture. We live in a time where we've seen unilateral acts and aggression. The war in Ukraine is accelerating discussions about a changing global order. And there is concern about how this legislation is going to be affecting geopolitics and particularly China-Russia relations.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think let's start with our policy on China in the last 30 years, which, you know, the consensus now has been misguided. Because we thought if we help China economically, if we help China's economy develop, and if they economically liberalize, there will be political liberalization. Eventually, they would start respecting global values, global norms, and the rules-based international order. That did not pan out. In fact, the opposite happened. The more economically powerful China became, more oppressive it became at home. They used their technology to suppress, oppress minorities and commit genocide. And they became more aggressive abroad. They used their economic coercion to coerce our allies and pretty much force other countries to bend the knee. And we're seeing it in our country, right? You know, when you look at the Hollywood, the Silicon Valley, Wall Street, even in our academic institutions, we're seeing people self-censoring themselves to basically protect this relationship with China. And anyone who's been watching the Chinese government, the CCP leadership, will tell you that in their mind, everything is linked in a way that any concession, in any human rights dialogue, we're trying to engage with them in order, and any concession we're making in order to engage in a human rights dialogue with them is not going to work. Thinking that if we basically, you know, mince our words, if we're cautious, somehow they're going to change. I think we passed that point. And as you've seen in the previous administration, the China policy that was established, that was a turning point. And that same China policy is being continued right now under the Biden administration, is that we are no longer trying to change China. We're no longer trying to change their behavior. We are trying to uphold our values, protect our national security and economic security, and we're trying to reduce our complicity in China's crimes by, for example, you know, disengaging from the forced labor made goods. What I'm trying to drive the point is that we know from the CCP leadership that they have already decided their policy, their goal is to ultimately displace the United States and become the dominant military and economic power in the world. Whatever we do, you know, is not going to change their goal, their strategy, their path is clear. The General Secretary Xi made it clear that they want to have a comprehensive national economic power. And even before the invasion of, in fact, a week before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia and China declared their friendship without limits. And as you alluded to, China, in this goal that I just mentioned, to become a dominant power, has a strategic interests and you know, common interests and values with Russia. Regardless of our action, whether this legislation or another legislation, or our, you know, if we're afraid, or our, you know, if we fear helping Ukraine, because of our relationship with China, no matter what we do, China is on its path to achieve its goals, and Russia is its best ally in this endeavor. That is not going to change. So all that to say, in short, in terms of the whole geopolitics, it is very important for us not to try to change, liberalize China, because we know that's not going to happen. In fact, it is getting worse. It is important for us to first make sure we are protecting our own security and economic interests and upholding our values and defending our values, because that is the only way to deal with the communist China that has been such an aggressive power in the world today.
Thank you. I'll go back to Anne-Marie because I've kept her waiting and I think she really wants to make a point. So Anne-Marie, please.
I do, thank you. And I don't want to take us back because Elnagar's points are certainly well taken. And but I may have over lawyered your question to me, Linda, and I don't want to leave any any question in anyone's mind that we are in fact enforcing that law exactly along the parameters that the ladies outlined.
Okay, thank you very much. Staying a little bit on that Russia issue and industry, a question from our audience: should industry expect a joint multilateral effort from countries against the importation of Chinese merchandise tainted by forced labor, similar to the multilateral export control efforts seen against Russia following the invasion? So you can see this is very much on people's minds, these comparisons between what is happening in China and how the world is already responding to Russian aggression. This is a question that I don't know if you would like to answer that, Anne-Marie, or really maybe it should go back to Elnige.
I can tell you what we're doing now, and we do engage on a regular basis with our colleagues in the customs agencies and in the government of our trading nations regularly. The EU has made no secret that they're considering legislation and to prevent the importation of merchandise with forced labor, and a large number of our other trading partners are working on legislation or have legislation in place. In addition to, as Rehan noted, the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, already does have provisions that prevent the importation of merchandise with forced labor. So I do think as the outcry is growing, that it is reasonable to anticipate more of our foreign trading partners acting against this.
Rehan, in the world that we live in and the aggression we just discussed, do you think that, and you know, we expect trade disruptions as a result of this of the new act, of this new legislation? Do you think putting so much of the emphasis or the responsibility, the pressure on the private sector is the best way forward?
I think we should reframe this question. We should not be looking at the trade-offs or cost-benefit analysis in terms of complying with the anti-slavery legislation, whether it's in the US or in the UK or in Australia, or human rights due diligence legislation, because this is a very much a clear-cut human rights crisis. Corporations are very much complicit in this crisis, as Elnige mentioned, and there are many companies that are actually named, and journalists have done their investigative oversight over companies that are complicit in Uyghur forced labor by shedding a light on how many companies that are implicated in the Uyghur crisis. Now, recently, AI technology enabled framework actually implicated close to 1 million companies potentially being implicated in Uyghur forced labor. And we do have UN guiding principles that is an international instrument that specifically mandates companies to comply with, compliance in relation to business and human rights. So, but it's not just that. The framework as it is that me as a human rights lawyer, I want to really take this question out of the geopolitical discussion, but to frame it within the law. We have, as Elnige mentioned, right now the Chinese government imposed their own anti-foreign sanctions law, basically preventing or prohibiting companies from complying with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So what should we be doing at this point? So I think it's really important that we need to highlight that we're asking the business to do the bare minimum, which is ridding their supply chains of Uyghur forced labor, and especially radically reshaping our supply chain. And it's already happening. COVID already disrupted the global supply chain. We've seen the impact of that. We already learned how to cope with supply chain disruption. But lastly, I think this question about Russia and Ukraine is, at the center of global, even like human rights discussion. Many communities are talking about complicity or double standards, that their issues are not getting enough attention. I, as a human rights lawyer, I'm glad that the Ukrainian issue is getting the deserving attention, because it is a war crime being committed at the moment. But I think it's a very comparable situation to the Uyghur crisis, except that we're not seeing corresponding response from the global community. What we saw is an unprecedented scale of corporations exiting from and retreating from Russia over sanctions and human rights concerns. I've seen incredibly beautifully, eloquently written piece by business executives how they are trying to stand up for human rights values. But exactly the same person and those executives couldn't do so in relation to genocide. What makes a genocide less of a crime than a war crime? In fact, the Ukrainians are pushing for genocide designation. So the reason why we're having this dialogue and discussion is that China's economy is much bigger economy compared to Russia. And that's why it's easier to stand up for values when it comes to smaller economy versus a big economy. But we're still seeing some of the positive changes because of this law, because of this discussion, and companies have been put on notice for years. Recently, Bloomberg did a wonderful piece analyzing where historically looking at, I think, over 15 years, when American companies ended up apologizing for Chinese government when they use any sort of political language of standing in solidarity with Hong Kong or Taiwan or any other issues. But when it comes to Xinjiang, at least vast majority of companies didn't apologize because, of course, they don't want to look so weak that they're actually somehow tacitly endorsing forced labor or slavery. But to some extent, it shows the power of the law. And importantly, we really need to remind ourselves, like, no company, I mean, there's a reputational cost, but also they cannot afford to break the law at this point. It's not about putting pressure on companies, but rather it's actually kind of like, everybody's talking about values and so, but these are companies that incorporated in Western economy, whether in the US or in the West. And the West has a wonderful international framework or legislation to uphold their compliance with human rights. So that's what we're asking. We're asking them to do bare minimum.
I see your argument. And as you said, you mentioned the press. I have an article here by Paul Schneider. It's an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. And I'm just going to read the title of this, and I'll probably ask Kit about this a little bit. It says, Biden has to choose human rights or climate change in China. And he gives the examples of electric car batteries, solar panels, and so on, relying on raw materials produced in China. So, I think, although, of course, we're here primarily to discuss human rights, we have to see some of the effects of what might happen when we do have shortages in supply chains. So, many of these components that are required to produce green energy are sourced from China. And there is a possibility that the US may be inhibited in meeting its green energy transition goals because it does not have the resources that it needs. Kit, I'd like your take on that. It's something that we've seen on a lot of people's minds. It's a lot in the press. What do you see happening there?
The United States has the capability and the capacity to create a long-lasting, forced labor-free supply chain for green energy. Whether it's electric vehicles, lithium that's coming from Xinjiang can be replaced elsewhere, silica can be replaced elsewhere. The IEA has stated that 80% of the world's solar panel production is connected back to China, with the majority of that obviously stemming back to Xinjiang. There's been calls by members of both parties on the Hill for CBP to more proactively target some of those Chinese solar manufacturers with the UFLPA entity list. And I think that's probably a fair point. But bottom line is that the US government and taxpayers are able to make a decision that if they want to meet their green friendly goals long term, we have the capability as a nation to do that. But we have to make that strategic decision and take a very long-term approach to it. Similar to the CHIPS Act in the semiconductor space, with the right political will, it's certainly possible to replicate these supply chains in a way that not only brings our allies closer, but in a way that, to Rayhan's point, eliminates the need to have this forced labor in the first place. So, in my mind, there's no question that we as a country can get to our green energy goals without having to rely on China or the subsidies that the Chinese government provides to companies that are not only implicit with forced labor, but also responsible for the development of military civil fusion capabilities.
Alinda,
you mentioned the word long term a lot, of course. Yeah, sure.
Can I add to the last two questions that were asked? Because it is a fair point that businesses raise. Why the burden is on us, why we're using trade for human rights purposes, why should we tolerate trade disruption? So I would like to add, Rayhan made a powerful argument about the values, why we should do it, because this is who we are. And, Kit made an important point about, yes, we have the capacity. We don't have to increase our dependence on China by further increasing our purchase of solar panels to fight climate change. I would like to add a point about why there was a need for such legislation, for such policy, to not to burden companies, to actually protect companies against the CCP Inc. Because our companies are, Chinese government is using illegal and unfair practices, including forced labor, and decimating our industries, including solar industry, destroying our livelihoods, displacing, American jobs. And despite all this, we were unable to do anything to fight back. So this legislation and similar legislation, such as Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for example, which, requires there should be no corruption when we do business. So there should be no engagement with forced labor when we do business. This actually protects US companies as well as other companies that are doing the right thing. Companies, I believe, would like to do the right thing, but given the pressure, economic pressure and competition and illegal, unfair competition from China, they resort to, pretty much turning a blind eye to the discrepancies in their supply chains. There, I think, is a need for a government intervention where the US government steps in and says, we are going to protect our companies against all these illegal practices. So as Kit said, we have the capacity we have the best and brightest in the world. We can build not just solar industry, the green energy, but the highest top technologies and next generation technologies. Yet we have to fight against these corporations that are illegally subsidized, and when our IP is stolen, it is hard to develop the technology and protect it. So the point I'm trying to drive is trade and human rights should absolutely be linked. I think it was a mistake to delink them in the first place. Imagine what China would be right now had we still conditioned their most favored nation status to their human rights record at home. We would have seen a much different China, not the one aggressively trying to dominate and control the world. So I would like to say short-term disruption was needed, whether it's in solar panels or in other markets, because the status quo is untenable. This was not in our interest, not in our economic interest, and this was against the rules-based international order, which states free and fair market. So I just want to make that point about this is about protecting companies. And as Anne-Marie mentioned, during my years at the NSC, we have interacted with private sector many times to basically make the point, tell us what you need. We're here to protect you. We're here to defend. We're here to level the playing field so you can actually compete fairly. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Rayhan, we are staying on the legal side of things. What further steps would you advise in order to pressure China in complying with international human rights regulations?
Just picking up on Alangar's point, before transitioning into human rights law, I was an anti-corruption lawyer, and a lot of my work is advising companies how to comply with the FCPA. And if you look at the legislative goal of the FCPA, this was like 30 years ago when Congress rolled out this legislation. Companies were very much concerned because would that put American companies at disadvantage versus like European companies, which are not bound to comply with similar legislation. But fast forward 30 years later, now FCPA like laws are implemented across the world. And I'm not talking about in the European economies, like in democratic countries, but also in Nigeria, in Singapore, many other countries, and emulating the US or US model for companies to enter into some sort of plea bargain if there's like a corruption allegations or disgorging any profits gained from corrupt practices, and sort of like distributing that. So we have seen the power of right legislation becoming an international instrument. So it's really important for companies to be ambassador for this law rather than somehow complaining in a sense that this is a law that's working against their interests. And we've seen like a powerful precedent through the FCPA law. So at the moment, right now, that in many countries, like for example, in the UK or Australia, there are laws, anti-slavery laws in the UK, in Australia, and in Europe as well. But oftentimes what these laws do is only mandate companies to report if there is some sort of forced labor involvement in their supply chain, but it doesn't go so far to criminalize or penalize these kind of illegal behaviors. And that's the kind of change that we must see. Now, Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is a right step, a good step in the right direction that I really hope that steer a conversation around creating anti-slavery regime. And this is not something that it does feel like, oh, it's incomprehensible to think about it. And I'm pretty sure lawyers 30 years from now, 10 years from now would look back at this period and say, I'm glad lawyers really stand up for the values of creating anti-slavery regime. That's why we're having this path-breaking legislation now became an international instrument. The European Parliament actually right now passed 2 resolutions by large margins on June 2020. The first resolution actually calls for new trade instrument that will ban import into the EU market all goods produced with forced labor. The second specifically focuses on Xinjiang, and it states that Chinese authorities human rights abuses in Xinjiang and crimes against humanity. But we have again this path-breaking law, and it really puts the burden on companies to disprove that there's forced labor. But if the Chinese companies still find a way to enter into global supply chain through Europe or other countries, then I think in a way that we would be weakening this legislation. So it's really important that other countries also contemplate and adopt a similar standard, because the demanding standard to put the onus on the companies to disprove by clear and convincing evidence, that's a very high standard. And it's not something that we rolled out because there's like a little forced labor allegation, because it is so pervasive, it's so inconceivable, and it is hurting Uyghurs right now. And indirectly, what we would love to see is that would change and modify the Chinese government's behavior. The Chinese government needs to understand that the global community, from consumers to global leaders, diplomats, everybody, lawmakers, nobody would tolerate an atrocity at this scale, at this unprecedented scale. And if we don't do so, we are creating a culture of impunity. And that is the kind of world that I personally don't want to live in. And I hope that the same sentiment can be echoed by everybody who's tuning in, lawmakers across the world. There's some good stuff in Europe.
I think pretty much everyone on the panel has started from the same starting point.
Yeah, so
and,
just to say that I would love to see similar laws implemented across the world.
Thank you, Rehan. Anne-Marie, back to this law and how it's being enforced, and basically a concluding remark with that. Do we have any statistics? I mean, I know it's any numbers of what's been happening so far. We're just, weeks in, but we discussed already certain precedents. How do you see things going in this short space of time?
So due to the length of the importation process, we don't really have a good set of statistics yet. It applies to merchandise that is imported on or after June 21st. Sometimes it takes 10 days, 2 weeks to even get the merchandise off the vessel. So we don't have anything really substantial to report at this point. We have done some detentions, some exclusions, but nothing that anyone can draw any conclusions from. I would love to tell you, I told myself, drop the mic. We did it. There's no more forced labor in the merchandise coming to the United States, but we just don't have that. We continue to enforce the WROs that have been in place for merchandise that doesn't hit the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, Prevention Act criteria, and for WROs that were in place before that are not subsumed under the Uyghur Act. We have in fiscal year to date, with regard to all of that, we've prevented the importation of, it's not a happy statistics, $358 million so far in this fiscal year of merchandise made with forced labor.
I'm sure it's something that, of course, you will continue monitoring, and I'm sure there'll be many other discussions here on the Atlantic Council and many other fora as well. I'd like to thank everyone for being with us. I'm afraid we really are running out of time. Just in case anybody wants to make like one tiny little final remark, please do.
I would like to refer everyone to the CBP's forced labor website, where we will be placing ongoing trade data and statistics as it becomes available, and additional tools and reference materials, training materials, so that both our trade stakeholders and our human rights organizations and those folks that contribute to the enforcement of our mission can have a place to receive additional data from CBP. And please don't hesitate to use our mailbox to send in requests for information or allegations for our action. Thank you for having me.
Very much.
Alinda, I
Thanks.
want to highlight one important question. There's no tension between achieving our climate change goal. Ultimately, it is about climate justice, achieving climate justice. Not only Uyghurs are suffering in the concentration camps, Uyghurs are living in the most polluted regions of China, where many mining companies are actually relocated to Xinjiang at this point. So when there seems to be some sort of like pitting progressive against conservative, as if like, this is something that progressive should not be behind, I want to make it clear that if we want to achieve climate justice, then we need to address this, because mining companies are thriving in Xinjiang at the same time. So you do want to go behind this legislation, and as well as addressing and making sure that, like the Uyghur atrocities end at this point.
Thanks very much, Rehan, for this, and many thanks to everyone for being with us and taking part, our audience as well, with their wonderful questions. It's time to say goodbye, I'm afraid. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You did a good job, Alinda. Elnigar, it was